A day after thousands of pagers exploded within seconds across Lebanon in a synchronized attack targeting Hezbollah, there are dozens of walkie-talkies that ended up blowing up across Lebanon. The series of blasts, which also wounded 450 people, came a day after the simultaneous explosion of hundreds of paging devices that were used by Hezbollah killed 12 people, including 2 children, and wounded up to 2,800 other people across Lebanon. The walkie-talkies were purchased by Hezbollah 5 months ago around the same time the pagers were bought. However, no country or no group has claimed responsibility for the attack. But fingers are directly pointing at Israel, raising the big question over the capabilities of Mossad. In fact, let's start off our conversation. Joining me on the telecast is Professor Nalapat. Professor Nalapat, can this be inferred as an all-out attack by Israel on its dare to the country to fight a war instead of using its proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas?
Look, I'd like to say one thing very clearly, and I've said that for a long time. Any organization that denies the right of Israel to exist and denies the Jewish people their inalienable and well-established right for their ancestral homeland, Israel, along with, of course, side by side in peace with the Palestinian state, that denier of Israel is frankly making a grievous error which will threaten its security. Hezbollah has found out the cost, and so has Hamas. In fact, so has the whole of Gaza found out the cost of being a denier of Israel. Don't forget, Megha, Israel is a nuclear power. When you're talking of all-out attack, I mean, a nuclear power can launch a nuclear attack. They can drop there are small, tactical nuclear devices that they could potentially drop, unlikely because of the territorial consanguinity. But don't forget, Israel is a very, very significant and substantial technological power. And today, technology drives defense. And if you have advanced tech, well, then it is the future. Advanced tech is where India is going under Prime Minister Modi. And Israel is well on the way towards advanced tech, because 50 million jobs may be lost through AI, but 75 million jobs are going to be gained through so-called deep tech, advanced tech. So Israel is a very ferocious challenger, and I think Hezbollah has begun to understand just exactly how big a challenge it is facing.
Yeah.
Hamas already understood it, and now I only hope it does not escalate to a situation where once again Lebanon is in ruins, because that poor country does not deserve to be in the same condition. No country, in fact, including Gaza, the territory of Gaza, deserves to be in the condition that Gaza is now. Thank you, Megha.
Okay. Jordan Cope also on the telecast with me. Jordan, I was talking about how this is one day after the next, showcasing Israel's capabilities militarily, where it has targeted and seems to have decimated whatever is left of Hamas along the Gaza Strip, or for that matter, the attacks, two well-planned targeted attacks on Hezbollah. In fact, there was the Iranian ambassador who was also grievously injured in the first set of attacks that took place yesterday. Day before yesterday. And do you think this is a one-sided war that Israel is all set to win, as has been the case since the time it was created in 1948?
I certainly don't think this current war is a one-direction war. I'd like to remind you that on October 7th, 2023, Hamas unilaterally invaded Israel on its own initiative. Hezbollah was actually supposed to be part of that invasion, except Hamas actually initiated it a bit early. Hamas beheaded, kidnapped, burned alive many, many innocent civilians. 1,200 civilians were killed in the operation, the terrorist attack. On top of that, 250 plus Israelis were taken hostage. And there have been accounts that have come out of Hamas actually raping many of its victims. And so it's unfortunately been a war that Israel didn't want, but unfortunately it was one that Israel has had to fight. Hezbollah also intervened on Hamas's behalf, both of them being Iranian proxies, receiving plenty of money from the Iranian government, and has fired approximately 7,500 rockets into Israel since the war has begun. 60,000 Israelis have been displaced from the north due to incoming Hezbollah rocket fire. And Israel has had no choice but to fight off these two terrorist organizations that have made very clear their intent to destroy Israel. Now, the recent pager and walkie-talkie operations have sent Hezbollah into serious disarray. The Iranian ambassador to Lebanon was injured in the pager operation, which ultimately caused approximately 4,000 explosions to date, 2,800 injuries, and reportedly approximately 20 members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps have actually been killed in these operations. And so what Israel has done at this point is ultimately reveal Hezbollah's vulnerabilities when it comes to not just its means of communication, but making its members feel fearful in this war that is now shifting. But it's important to get the narrative right. Israel is not escalating a war that didn't exist. This war was already very well existing.
No, absolutely. I agree with you. I agree with you. But then, taking a look back at history, whether it is about the Arab-Israeli wars that had taken place, or we talk about the Intifadas, it was Israel that had been pushed into such a precarious situation that it had no other option but to fight the war. And like I said, the war started, whether it was about the countries that were in retaliation, questioning the very existence of Israel and a Jewish country. We talk about Jordan and Syria and Egypt at one point of time. But some of these have taken a turnaround in terms of how they view in Israel, which is also the transformation that has happened over the past several decades. But the war is then primarily ended by Israel in showcasing its victory and a massive, you have to give this particular thing that has happened. It is the United States of America that has been standing by Israel since the beginning to ensure that the Israelis are able to bring down the terrorism that has been brought onto them.
I think it's a momentous operation which just happened, and as you said, I mean, it doesn't matter how Israel responds; it will always be criticized. Israel has existed since 1948, and effectively, even before Israel was in control of Gaza or the West Bank, there were still state actors and entities that have tried to destroy Israel. And unfortunately, one of those non-state actors today seeking to destroy Israel are the Iranian proxies, such as Hamas and Hezbollah. And it should be noted that the Hezbollah threat is still very real. Hezbollah has a weapon stockpile that it has amassed over the last decade and some that now amounts to 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel, some of them being precision guided and possibly able to strike major civilian population centers such as the Tel Aviv area. And so it's important to note that there's only one state with a predominantly Jewish population throughout the world. That's the current nation of Israel. And unfortunately, many Islamist entities of varying ideologies ultimately find common ground in their desire to destroy Israel. And this is a war that India should take very seriously. To the best of my knowledge, there are only two predominantly Hindu majority countries, India and Nepal. And India has definitely faced the brunt of terrorism and should unite with Israel in helping Israel combat the current threat, especially on the diplomatic front and in the UN.
Okay, all right. Ambassador Mahesh Sachdev, let's try to understand whether Iran at this point of time and its capability to fight Israel on its own than to be using proxies such as Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis.
Thank you, Megha. Without taking issues which go beyond the remit of this discussion, I would like to confine myself to your question. Iran has cultivated uh, a- an excess of resistance, as it is called it calls it, uh, for over a period of past 40 years. In 82, it established a toehold in Lebanon through Hezbollah, and Hamas links with Israel, with Iran, are not very well known. It is rumored that it had some smuggling through Sinai of Iranian hardware to burnish it, but there are fundamental differences between Hamas and Iran. Hamas is a Sunni organization, while Iran is a Shia theocracy. There is also Arab nationalism versus pan-Islamism that comes to fore. Be it as it may, Iran's support for Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthis is fairly well established, and I think it's a part of their doctrine to export their revolution and keep Iran safe from aggressive powers, which they call little shaitan and big shaitan, basically Israel and United States. So it's their own self-imagery, which mirrors of what Israel has its own, that perceives it to be the only Shia country and only revolutionary Islamic country in the area, and it fears being inundated on one hand by Sunni Arab countries. It also fears being sanctioned out of shape economically and politically by Americans and the West, which have imposed large and fairly rigid sanctions on Iran. So they have evolved their own dynamic foreign policy, part of which is through this crescent axis of Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthis. Another part is the crescent of states that support them, Iraq and Syria and Lebanon to some extent. So they use all these devices to keep attention focused away from their own mainland.
Okay.
And this strategy is also buttressed by evolving their own technology, which is based on missiles and rockets and drones. They have been under sanctions, so they do not have access to all sort of hardware. That has lent them certain emphasis on self-reliance in defense field, and recent case of missile, drones, etc., being exported of all places to Russia.
Okay.
Is a case in point.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Rupinder Sachdev, how do you view this in terms of the end goal of Iran when it knows that it does not have the means to fight Israel directly, and has it been successful up until a certain extent in its goal, in achieving it?
Interesting. I think the end goal of Iran perhaps is not, winning a war. It cannot win a war, right? So the end goal as of now is perhaps to keep prodding and troubling Israel as much as it can, and also Saudi, and playing the power games. Because Iran cannot go to war. Iran will not want to. It will avoid because it does not have capabilities. I mean, Israel is miles and miles away. So the only way for Iran to reach there is via, let's say, the Air Force or missiles. Iran's Air Force is antiquated. Israeli air defense is pretty good, as well as the US and NATO will step in, even for the missiles. So Iran will not be able to inflict any damage virtually on Israel. Vice versa, Israel could inflict a lot of damage on Iran via air power. What Iran could do is, yes, I think the parts of the limbs of the octopus or the axis of resistance, right, is that provoke land offensives against Israel via, of course, one is Hezbollah, other is Hamas, which is already happening and which is definitely, as Ambassador Mahesh they says, there are differences therein. But yeah, sure, enemy is my friend kind of a thing also is at play here. And the Houthi. So Iran would try to, manage as much as it can with these, as its tentative or not tentative, as its midterm, near term, because it cannot win a war till the time, let's say, it gets a nuclear capability. That's another dimension. Now, here, Israel's, from what I see, is that Israel and this conflict will go to Iran. Israel is perhaps looking at this moment as, a very major moment, of course, which it is, in which to kind of make sure that, all its threats are neutralized. And especially Iran is neutralized before it achieves a nuclear capability. Now, coming back here to Hamas, Hamas has played its role. Hezbollah is playing its role. But by the way, I do think that Israel has not had 100% pure golden victory so far. Firstly, there is no victory so far. Gaza is not completed. Hezbollah is challenging. So, but yes, Israel is dominant, absolutely. But Israel is paying a price for it also, which it has to pay, unfortunately, as in terms of its own internal divisions are widening. The sense of security in Israel was the Israeli state will guarantee the safety and security of the Jewish people, right? The state of Israel has failed in that sense, right? So that's a huge one. So that's a psychological shock to Israel also, I would say.
Okay.
But that said, Israel, and with these pager attacks and all, I would think that, there are only 3 quick points, I would say, on these pager attacks. One, these were made by Israel definitely to show the Hezbollah and cripple their capabilities, etc., psychological. Other, it could be very much, you see, when you go or launch a big invasion, you would want to knock out the communication control command of your enemy. So this could be a precursor to that. So that could mean, I don't know, in the next 24 hours, a major, attack by Israel should be in order per that school of thought. And lastly, there is another notion going around that apparently Hezbollah folks discovered that these pagers were, let's say, decoys, or they were having some, explosives embedded. And Israel found out that Hezbollah is getting to know, so they pressed the button that let's use it, otherwise they would have lost it. So use it or lose it was the choice in front of Israel.
Okay, all right. Professor Nalapat, it's amply clear that the war is now moving away from Gaza and onto the northern border of Israel, which is Lebanon and Syria. Of course, this is a shift that has been made as per the decision after having assessed the situation on the ground. Can we say safely that Hamas has been brought under control down to its knees, and the next step now is the other second more potent threat, which is Hezbollah?
Well, I think the military wing of Hamas, frankly, is not even 1/10 of what it was before this extremely horrible terror attack on Israel. Israel, frankly, ignored Hamas, and Hamas would have been wise to ignore Israel, but foolishly and very frankly, toxically went ahead. It's the whole process a steep price. All the Palestinian people are paying a steep price. But Megha, I want to point out that India, diplomatically, we have basically been still showing our regard for Israel. For example, we abstained, if I'm not mistaken, in the UNGA vote. We did not vote against the Israelis at all. We just abstained. A lot of countries voted against Israelis. We abstained. As far as Iran is concerned, I have always had the view it's too big a country to try and subdue war. You have to do it through regime change. And frankly, it's a regime which is very unpopular and which frankly can be subjected to change. That is the avenue that needs to be gone through, rather than, if I may say so, attacking. And lastly, Megha, may I point out, please, it doesn't make sense for Hezbollah to basically use the weapons, these devices, if it understands that it is basically been compromised. I mean, why would they do that? If I know this smartphone is compromised, I'm certainly not going to use it. I'm going to throw it, I mean, keep it far away. So I don't think that that's much logic. But having said that, I'd like to point out, please remember, Russia and Iran and China are linked together. We are talking of Cold War 2.0. In this era of this Cold War 2.0, unfortunately, diplomatic errors by the Western world have led to and China coming very close together. Israel has been more careful diplomatically, but unfortunately the West has not been. So frankly, it's going to be a difficult ask to completely destroy Hamas or Hezbollah. But as far as the military wing is definitely on its knees, and Hezbollah, the Israelis can bring it to its knees. As far as Iran is concerned, I again repeat that it's better to aim for regime change rather than all-out war, because an all-out war with Iran, God knows which regional and international complications that would lead to, and even the United States will be nervous about it.
Okay, all right. Jordan, how do you view the situation, keeping in mind the perspective that the Arab nations in the Gulf have vis-a-vis Israel? And I pointed out, these countries like Egypt and Jordan at one point of time were heavily against Israel and the creation of the country and the Jews. And at the same time, when you talk about UAE and Saudi Arabia, their nonchalant stance when it comes to the Israeli counterattack on Hamas and now fighting the Hezbollah.
Unfortunately, much of the Arab world still continues to criticize Israel on how it conducts its operation, largely to save face with their own populations. They might actually have peace with Israel, but they also understand that they have to keep their population satisfied. And so it's a good question you raise, because a large motivation for Iran in supporting its proxies throughout these operations, these terrorist attacks, is that Iran gets to sabotage potential prospective future normalization agreements between Israel and much of the rest of the Middle East, including that which might soon emerge with Saudi Arabia. Another motive, perhaps, that Iran has in sustaining and supporting and fueling this war is to allow Iran effectively to distract Israel from focusing on its nuclear development program, which is very near to being able to produce its first nuclear warheads. And so relations between Israel and the Arab world are quite interesting and tricky during this time. Egypt is supposedly an ally and yet of Israel, a friend of Israel, and yet approximately 50 tunnels were discovered connecting the Gaza Strip to Egypt. It's very questionable how those tunnels were built and how the Egyptian military couldn't identify them in a timely manner. But realistically speaking, for a long time, we've had to question how have weapon supplies managed to infiltrate and get into Gaza. And I would suspect there's a good chance that they were coming through those tunnels. So Israel's in a tricky position. It has to navigate a very tricky region, one that is a powder keg. And not just because of this war. Lebanon itself very much has its own sectarian tensions between its three religious communities and the quest for power between them. And so Israel has to navigate very carefully this region. Okay. It has to understand who its allies are and to best prepare.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Sajdev, now India is also walking a tightrope in terms of showcasing its support to Israel versus the two-nation theory and the Palestinian cause. And while we may have abstained from the UNGA resolution, recently we have also not declared Hamas as a terrorist organization.
That is correct. We have a tripwire to walk through. There are 9.5 million Indian expatriates in the Gulf alone, and if you count the rest of the Arab world, the number would go even higher. We get about 70% of our crude before Russians stepped in from the Gulf. Now the percentage is lower. There are also investments from the Gulf that need to be welcomed for India's infrastructure development, tourism, and what have you. There are plenty of trade opportunities that India has, and we are busy signing off I2U2 and FTAs with the GCC countries, etc. So there's plenty much at stake, and Prime Minister Modi particularly has made this a bridge across the Arabian Sea an important priority of his foreign policy. He's paid no less than 6 visits to UAE alone, and has been to practically all countries of the GCC. So that is all there. Prime Minister has also become the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Israel and has been to Palestine Authority as well. So all that shows the dynamism of India's foreign policy. But at the same time, I think we have to meander this rift very carefully. We have managed to do so far. There is no compromise on our stated principles of two-state solution. There is no compromise on our advocacy of security and stability in the region, particularly that of Israel. At the same time, there's so much at stake that a wider conflagration should not take place, which could risk nearly 1 crore Indians in the Gulf.
Yeah.
And India has to navigate itself very, very carefully.
Okay. Rupinder Sachdev, what's the road ahead? Are we at this point in time witnessing this war that is not ending in the near future? And how does this impact India? And there's also already been, it's been spoken about by Ambassador Sachdev, we talk about I2U2. Is this then a non-starter? And we talk about IMEC, which is going to be a heavy investment for India along with the other nations in the Middle East, and then Europe would be a difficult thing to start until this violence ends.
Thank you, Megha. Great question. I think Ambassador and Professor Narapat and Jordan have touched upon it. Okay, if it were to be I2U2 and the Indo-Middle East European corridor, between the two, see, I2U2 would go on. Okay, because that's a convening, that's a grouping, a discussion could be happening virtually or could be happening physically, right? Whereas the India-Middle East corridor, that thing would be delayed, yes, because that's a physical, infrastructure project which has to be laid through. Looking at the way things are right now, it does not seem possible, or what the midterm future does look like is that the conflict will be ongoing. See, Hamas, howsoever Israel may be eliminate the military thing, how will they, not finally, but fully, but properly, govern Gaza? Gaza would remain a hot spot of mix of things. The law and order there itself, would influence many things in Israel. That's one. Second, if any conflict escalates between Israel and Hezbollah, that will continue. Talking of a two-state solution, only yesterday, I think the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, in a meeting of the Shura, on behalf of his father, he said that Saudi Arabia will not normalize relations with Israel unless there is a two-state solution. And honestly, a two-state solution does not seem to be happening the way things are. Israel is dead set against it. If we look, the landscape out there, and all others are asking for it. So there is no scope and a two-state solution with East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestine state. Okay, that is not happening. So if that's not happening, this heightened level of conflicts. And another thing which I think Jordan perhaps mentioned, very important. The Saudis and the UAEs and all, they are sure tempering their statements because their public opinion is different, right? So that means if it were to be a democracy, then it would mean that if the opinion of the majority was to be the foreign policy of Saudi Arabia, that would not be in favor of Israel.
Okay.
And that is part of the reason these, at least the monarchs in this region are very afraid that if there is so much of a dissonance between their policies towards Israel, there could be rebellions in these countries. These royalties could be thrown over.